"You must be joking," Brittany Whitmore said, loud enough for the last row to hear. The courtroom went still before the judge ever touched his gavel. Every head turned toward her, toward the young woman standing in the center aisle with white sunglasses perched on her head, a cream designer coat folded over one arm, and a smile that looked more practiced than human. She had arrived 17 minutes late, walking past the metal detector as if security were a suggestion meant for other people. The scent of expensive perfume drifted behind her like a warning. Her heels clicked against the old tile floor, sharp and steady, each step sounding too confident for a room built on consequences. At the front, beneath the seal of the state and the flag hanging motionless behind the bench, Judge Marcus Ellison looked down at the case file in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not frown. He simply waited the way mountains wait through storms. Brittany stopped beside her attorney and looked up at him for the first time. The smile grew wider. "This is a joke, right?" she said. A black judge. A faint gasp moved through the gallery. Someone in the second row dropped a pen. Elena Brooks, seated near the aisle with a brace on her wrist and her young son tucked close against her side, lowered her eyes as if the words had landed on her skin too. The boy, Caleb, no older than 8, tightened his small hands around a broken toy car with one wheel missing. Brittany noticed them and gave a little laugh through her nose, like she had found the whole scene beneath her. Her attorney, Paul Mercer, leaned toward her quickly, whispering her name with panic hidden under politeness, but Brittany barely looked at him. She was used to whispers. She was used to people cleaning up after her before the stain could spread. Behind her, near the polished wooden doors, her father Richard Whitmore stood with his jaw set and his phone already in his hand, the silver watch on his wrist catching the fluorescent light. He owned shopping centers, apartment towers, 2 local news sponsors, and enough favors to make most rooms bend before he entered them. This room did not bend. Judge Ellison finally lifted his eyes. They were calm, dark, and unreadable. Not cold. Not soft. Just present. The kind of presence that made excuses sound smaller before they were even spoken. He looked at Brittany, then at her father, then back at the file. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice even and low, "you are not late to my courtroom. You are late to accountability." The words did not thunder. They did something worse. They settled. Brittany blinked once, surprised that he had answered her at all. For the first time since she entered, the smile on her face shifted just a fraction, like a crack appearing in fresh paint. The courtroom held its breath. Outside the tall windows, morning light washed over the stone steps of the courthouse, bright and indifferent. Inside, every sound became sharper. The hum of the vents, the rustle of legal paper, the quiet click of a court reporter's keys waiting to catch whatever came next. Marcus Ellison placed one hand on the edge of the bench, steady and open. He had heard words like hers before. In school hallways. In courthouse corridors. In elevators where strangers assumed his suit belonged to someone else. But today he was not a boy swallowing humiliation. He was not a young attorney being mistaken for security. He was the judge. And the law for once would not be rushed aside by money, fear, or a last name polished bright enough to blind people. Brittany shifted her weight, her confidence returning in a sharper form. "My father owns half this city," she said, softer now, but still loud enough to cut. "You might want to remember that." Judge Ellison's hand moved at last. The gavel came down once, not hard, not angry, but final. The sound traveled through the courtroom like a door locking from the inside. "And you," he said, "might want to remember where you are." Judge Marcus Ellison had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than anger. He let the echo of the gavel fade until it disappeared into the corners of the courtroom, then looked down at the file again, not because he needed to read it, but because he wanted the room to remember that this was not theater. This was a court of law. The paper in front of him was thick with reports, witness statements, emergency room records, photographs of a rain-slick intersection, and the first draft of a police summary that had changed 3 times before reaching his bench. Marcus had been at the courthouse before sunrise, sitting alone in chambers while the city outside was still dark blue and quiet. He had read every page with the slow attention his mother once gave to overdue bills at their kitchen table in Baltimore, where the radiator hissed in winter and the summer heat pressed through the windows like a hand. Back then, Marcus was just a skinny boy in a button-down shirt too large for his shoulders, waiting beside his mother in a courthouse hallway while people walked past them as if they were furniture. His mother, Lorraine Ellison, had been accused by a landlord of taking rent money she had never touched. The landlord had arrived with a lawyer, polished shoes, and a voice full of certainty. Lorraine had arrived with cracked hands from cleaning office buildings, a bus transfer in her purse, and the truth. No one seemed interested in the truth until a tired clerk found the missing receipt under the wrong tenant file. Marcus never forgot the way his mother stood after that. Not triumphant, not loud, just straight-backed, as if dignity were the only coat she owned. Years later, when he passed the bar, when he became a prosecutor, when he was appointed to the bench, people congratulated him as if he had escaped the world that shaped him. Marcus knew better. He had carried it with him. He carried the sound of keys in courthouse locks, the smell of wet wool coats in crowded hallways, the quiet fear of people who could not afford a mistake. That was why he did not rush. That was why he did not perform. Every person who entered his courtroom deserved to be more than their worst day, but no one was entitled to make another human being invisible. He glanced toward Elena Brooks. She sat with her left wrist held carefully in her lap, shoulders drawn in, trying to look smaller than her pain. Her son Caleb leaned against her side, his sneakers not quite touching the floor. Marcus saw the boy watching him, searching his face for something. Steady. Children did that in courtrooms. They looked for the adult who seemed least likely to disappear. Brittany Whitmore, meanwhile, stood with her chin lifted and her lips pressed into a faint smirk, as if the pause itself offended her. She had not yet understood that Marcus was giving her a chance to recognize the weight of the room before the room placed its weight on her. Her attorney rose halfway from his chair. "Your Honor, my client is under considerable emotional strain," he said carefully. Marcus looked at him. "Then advise your client to stop speaking from a place of comfort and start listening from a place of consequence." The attorney sat down slowly. Richard Whitmore shifted near the back doors, his phone now lowered, his face unreadable except for the muscle tightening along his jaw. Marcus had seen that look before. Men like Richard did not fear guilt. They feared loss of control. The court reporter adjusted her hands over the keys. The bailiff stood motionless beside the wall. A thin line of sunlight crossed the floor and touched the base of the witness stand. Marcus turned a page in the file, then another. His voice remained calm when he spoke again. "This court is not interested in last names, campaign donations, social standing, private influence, or public embarrassment. This court is interested in what happened at the intersection of Halsted and Monroe at 9:46 on a rainy Thursday night. Why a woman was left injured on the pavement, why the first report omitted key details, and why the defendant walked into this room believing mockery would serve her better than remorse." Brittany looked away first. It was quick, almost nothing, but Marcus saw it. So did Elena. So did Caleb, whose small fingers tightened around the broken toy car in his lap as if the truth had already begun to move. Brittany Whitmore had grown up in rooms where consequences arrived wearing someone else's name. In her father's house, mistakes were not corrected. They were managed. A broken window became a contractor problem. A cruel comment became a public relations misunderstanding. A reckless night became a sealed settlement with quiet signatures and thicker envelopes. Richard Whitmore had built his fortune from glass towers and luxury apartments across the city, but the real foundation of his empire was not concrete or steel. It was access. He knew which council member needed a fundraiser, which editor needed advertising money, which retired police captain still answered private calls after dinner. Brittany learned that world before she learned humility. She learned that doors opened when her last name was spoken. She learned that apologies were optional when lawyers were available. And she learned that people without power could be pushed aside so gently that the world would call it procedure. That morning, standing inside the courtroom with all eyes on her, she still believed she was inside one of her father's rooms. She believed the old pattern would hold. First outrage, then pressure, then delay, then confusion. Then everyone would get tired, and the Whitmore name would walk out clean again. Her attorney, Paul Mercer, kept one hand near his legal pad and the other near his patient's, but even he looked uneasy now. He had represented celebrities, executives, and politicians whose private behavior did not match their public smiles. Yet Brittany worried him in a different way. She did not understand caution. She treated warning signs like compliments. Richard, near the back of the courtroom, finally stepped forward with the slow confidence of a man used to being recognized before being introduced. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver hair was combed back with quiet precision. He gave Judge Ellison a measured nod, the kind that sounded polite only if you ignored the message beneath it. "Your Honor," Richard said, "I believe this situation has already become unnecessarily emotional." The word emotional floated through the courtroom and settled near Elena Brooks like dust. Elena lifted her eyes for a second, then lowered them again. She was a registered nurse at St. Mary's Medical Center, a woman who worked 12-hour overnight shifts, packed Caleb's lunch before sunrise, and paid rent in a small second-floor apartment 10 blocks from the hospital. She did not have a driver, a publicist, or a family attorney waiting in the hall. She had a bus pass, a stack of medical bills, and a son who had stopped sleeping well since the night of the accident. Marcus watched Richard carefully. Men like him chose words the way other men chose locks. "Unnecessarily emotional," Marcus repeated, slowly enough for the court reporter to catch every syllable. "A woman came to this court after being left injured in the rain. Her child is seated beside her. Your daughter is facing charges supported by evidence this court has not yet fully heard. If emotion enters this room, Mr. Whitmore, it will not be treated as a defect. It will be treated as part of the human cost." Richard's face tightened, but only slightly. Brittany rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she murmured. The sound was small, but in the silence of the courtroom it carried. Paul Mercer leaned close again. "Brittany, stop." She pulled her arm away from his whisper without looking at him. "No, I am tired of pretending this is fair," she said. She saw a chance to get money, and now everyone is acting like I am some monster. Elena went still. Caleb's toy car slipped a little in his hands, its cracked plastic wheel making a tiny click against the wooden bench. Marcus noticed the sound. He also noticed the way Brittany did not. The girl had not looked at the child once as a child, only as part of the problem. Outside, a siren passed somewhere beyond the courthouse, thin and distant, fading between the tall buildings. Inside, Judge Ellison turned another page in the file. The police report sat on top now, clean and official, but too clean in the wrong places. Missing times. Adjusted language. Passive sentences where human choices should have been. Vehicle made contact. Subject departed location. Witness uncertain. Marcus had read enough reports to know when the truth was being dressed for burial. He looked at the prosecutor. "Call your first witness," he said. Brittany gave a faint laugh, but it did not sound as steady as before. Richard Whitmore glanced toward the side door, where two reporters had just been allowed into the back row. And for the first time that morning, the family that owned half the city began to understand that the other half was watching. The prosecutor stood with a folder pressed flat against her palm, but the first witness was not a police officer, not a doctor, and not an expert with framed degrees. It was Elena Brooks. She rose slowly from the second row, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to lean toward her, not out of curiosity, but out of the quiet respect people feel when someone carrying pain chooses to stand anyway. Caleb started to rise with her, but she touched his shoulder and whispered for him to stay seated. The boy obeyed, though his eyes followed every careful step she took toward the witness stand. Her shoes made almost no sound on the tile. The brace on her wrist caught the overhead light. When she reached the stand and placed her hand where the clerk directed, Brittany let out a breathy little laugh, just loud enough to be cruel, just soft enough to pretend it had not happened. Judge Ellison looked at her. He did not speak. He did not need to. The warning in his silence landed harder than a raised voice. Elena sat down, smoothed the front of her navy blouse, and looked toward the prosecutor. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. She had been walking home from the hospital after her shift because the bus was running late and rain had already started to thin the streets. She remembered the sound of tires through water, the flash of headlights turning too fast, and then the world becoming pavement, rain, and the taste of fear in her mouth. She did not describe it with drama. She did not ask the room to imagine more than it had to. She spoke like a nurse, precise and careful, naming the intersection, the time, the weather, the color of the light. The more calmly she spoke, the smaller Brittany seemed to become, not in size but in certainty. Paul Mercer rose for cross-examination with a face arranged into sympathy. He asked whether Elena was tired after a 12-hour shift. She said yes. He asked whether the rain made visibility poor. She said yes. He asked whether she could be absolutely sure of the vehicle. Elena looked at him, then passed him toward Brittany. I saw her get out, she said. The courtroom changed temperature. Even the court reporter stopped for half a breath before continuing. Mercer adjusted his tie. Miss Brooks, under stress, memories can become confused. Elena nodded once. I agree. That is why I wrote everything down in the emergency room before they gave me anything for the pain. The prosecutor lifted her eyes. Marcus saw Richard Whitmore shift in the back row. That had not been in the version of events his people expected. Elena continued. She said Brittany stood under a black umbrella held by a man from a dark sport utility vehicle that arrived minutes later. She said Brittany looked at her, not with panic, not with concern, but with annoyance, as if Elena had become an inconvenience in the road. Brittany leaned toward her attorney, whispering sharply now. Her confidence was no longer polished. It was cracking at the edges. Then Elena turned slightly toward Judge Ellison. Your Honor, I do not want revenge, she said. I just want the truth to stop being treated like it belongs only to people who can afford it. The words settled over the courtroom with a heaviness no one could decorate. Caleb stared at his mother with wide, shining eyes, still clutching the broken toy car. Marcus felt something old move inside him, not anger, not pity, but recognition. His mother had once sat in a room like this with the same quiet courage, asking only to be believed. Before he could speak, Brittany stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Mercer reached for her sleeve, but she stepped away. She is acting like some saint because she knows it works in front of people like him. She pointed toward the bench, and the last word came out coated in contempt. Do not pretend this is justice. This is a performance. The bailiff moved one step forward. Richard whispered her name from the back, low and urgent. Marcus lifted his hand and everyone stopped. He looked at Brittany for a long measured second. Miss Whitmore, he said, you will sit down and you will not insult this witness again. Brittany's face flushed. Or what? She said. The question hung there, reckless and bright. Judge Ellison's eyes did not leave hers. Or you will learn the difference between privilege and protection. Brittany did not sit down right away. That was the first mistake the entire room could see. She stood there in her cream coat and expensive heels, breathing through her nose, looking less like a defendant and more like a woman waiting for someone beneath her to remember his place. Paul Mercer rose beside her, pale now, one hand hovering near her elbow without touching it. Your Honor, my client will comply, he said quickly. She needs a moment. Judge Ellison kept his eyes on Brittany. Then she may take that moment seated. The words were simple, but they left no soft place to hide. Brittany lowered herself into the chair with a sharp movement, the wooden legs making a hard scrape against the floor. Elena remained in the witness stand, hands folded carefully, her face composed in the way people learn when breaking down would make others call them unstable. Caleb watched from the second row, his broken toy car pressed against his chest now, as if he could hold the little machine together by force. The prosecutor asked only 2 more questions. Elena answered both without embellishment. Yes, she had seen the defendant step out of the vehicle. Yes, she had heard someone say they needed to get ahead of the story. At that phrase, Richard Whitmore looked down at his phone, but he did not type. His thumb rested over the dark screen, frozen above his own reflection. Then Paul Mercer began again, this time softer, trying to rebuild control from the ruins Brittany had made. He asked whether Elena had ever considered a civil settlement. Elena said no one had offered one to her directly. He asked whether she had spoken to reporters. Elena said she had not. He asked whether her son had been influenced by what she believed she saw. That was when Caleb moved. Not much. Just a small shift on the bench, a tightening around the toy car. A child trying very hard to become invisible and failing because fear has its own sound. Marcus noticed. So did Elena. Her voice changed, still calm but lower. Please do not bring my son into this as if he is a strategy, she said. Mercer paused. The room went quiet enough to hear the courthouse clock clicking above. The double doors. Brittany leaned back and whispered something. But this time her whisper was not quiet enough. Maybe teach him not to lie for attention. Elena closed her eyes. Caleb's face fell in a way no child's face should fall in public. The bailiff stepped forward again. The prosecutor rose. Paul Mercer whispered, "Brittany, enough." But the damage had already entered the air. Judge Ellison placed both hands flat on the bench. For the first time that morning, the calm around him seemed heavier than before, not broken but gathered. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "stand." She looked startled. "What?" "Stand." She stood slowly, trying to make defiance look graceful. Marcus looked at the court reporter. "Let the record reflect that the defendant has repeatedly interrupted these proceedings, insulted the witness, and made a disparaging remark toward a minor present in the courtroom." Brittany's mouth opened. Richard Whitmore moved from the back row. "Your Honor, with respect, this has gone far enough." Marcus turned his gaze to him. The courtroom seemed to narrow. "Mr. Whitmore, if you speak again without being called, you will join your daughter in being formally cited for contempt." Richard stopped. The silence after that was different. It was the silence of a room watching money meet a wall it could not buy. Brittany's eyes sharpened with embarrassment. Embarrassment, Marcus knew, was dangerous in people who had never learned humility. She pointed toward Elena, then toward the bench. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her voice rising. "You people protect each other and call it justice." No one moved. Even the reporters in the back row stopped writing for a second, stunned by the plainness of it. Paul Mercer lowered his head as if something inside him had finally given up. Elena did not answer. She did not need to. Caleb stared at the floor. Judge Ellison looked at Brittany for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled enough to feel almost merciful. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," he said. "During that time, counsel will explain to his client that this courtroom is not a stage for prejudice, and that every word spoken here has weight." He brought the gavel down once. Brittany flinched at the sound. It was small, but everyone saw it. As the room rose, Marcus stepped away from the bench without looking back. In the hallway behind chambers, where the walls smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, he stopped for one breath. Not because he was shaken, because he refused to let her ugliness decide the shape of his justice. In chambers, Judge Marcus Ellison stood beside the narrow window and watched the courthouse steps below fill with movement. Reporters gathered near the front rail. Attorneys crossed the plaza with briefcases swinging at their sides. A delivery truck idled against the curb, its hazard lights blinking amber against the pale morning. The city kept breathing as if nothing inside that courtroom had split open, as if a child had not just been made smaller by a woman old enough to know better, as if a mother had not been asked to defend her pain like it was an invoice. Marcus loosened his fingers from the edge of the windowsill. His hands were steady. That mattered to him. Anger was easy. Anger could make a man feel righteous for a moment and careless for a lifetime. His mother had taught him that without ever calling it a lesson. When people tried to humiliate her, she did not give them the satisfaction of watching her collapse. She folded her receipts, lifted her chin, and let truth take the longest road if it had to. Marcus turned from the window and looked at the framed photograph on the corner shelf. Lorraine Ellison in a blue church dress on the day he became a judge, her hand resting on his robe, her smile tired but bright. She had passed 3 years later, quietly before sunrise, leaving behind a Bible full of notes, a drawer full of neatly paid bills, and one sentence Marcus still heard whenever cruelty entered his courtroom. "Do not let their hate borrow your hands." He closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Elena Brooks sat on a wooden bench with Caleb beside her. The recess had scattered people into corners, but no one came too close to them. Pain made strangers cautious. Caleb held the broken toy car in both hands, turning it over, touching the tiny scratched roof with his thumb. Elena watched him instead of the reporters. Her face was calm, but Marcus could see the effort holding it together. The invisible work of a mother trying to keep her child from learning too much about the world in one morning. Caleb whispered something. Elena leaned closer. "Is he going to let her win?" the boy asked. The question was so quiet that only his mother heard it, but it seemed to travel through the polished hallway anyway. Elena swallowed. "No, baby," she said softly. "He is listening." Caleb looked down at the toy car. One of its wheels was cracked, and the front bumper was scraped white where the paint had come off. It looked like a little thing, the kind of object a tired parent might almost throw away while cleaning a backpack, but Caleb held it like it remembered something he could not say out loud. Across the hall, Brittany stood near a marble column while Paul Mercer spoke quickly into her ear. She was not crying. She was not sorry. She was embarrassed, and embarrassment had sharpened her expression into something colder. Richard Whitmore stood a few feet away, facing the wall, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low enough to hide the words but not the urgency. His polished shoes reflected in the floor like dark water. When the bailiff opened the courtroom doors again, the hallway changed. People rose. Conversations snapped shut. Elena took Caleb's hand. Brittany pushed past her attorney without looking at anyone. Marcus returned to the bench a moment later, robe falling straight around him, face composed. The room settled into silence before he sat down. He looked first at Elena, then at Caleb, then at Brittany, and finally at the prosecutor, who now held a small evidence bag in one hand. Inside it was the broken toy car. Marcus did not react, but something in the air shifted. The quiet had not been empty. It had been waiting. The prosecutor placed the evidence bag on the table as carefully as if it contained something alive. For a moment, no one seemed to understand why a child's broken toy had entered a courtroom built for sworn statements and sealed documents. Brittany looked at it, then looked away with a small, irritated breath. Richard Whitmore stopped whispering to the man beside him. Caleb sat very still beside his mother, his eyes fixed on the little car through the clear plastic. Judge Ellison leaned slightly forward, not enough to show surprise, only enough to show attention. The prosecutor's voice was steady. Your Honor, this item was collected from Miss Brooks's personal belongings after her hospital admission. It was returned to her son 2 days later. Yesterday evening, Miss Brooks contacted our office after Caleb mentioned something she did not know. Paul Mercer stood immediately. Objection. This sounds like surprise evidence. The prosecutor did not look at him. The defense was notified this morning as soon as the data was recovered. The device was examined by a certified digital forensics technician. Chain of custody has been documented. Mercer's jaw tightened. We need time to review. Marcus looked at the file, then at the prosecutor. Proceed only as to foundation. The prosecutor nodded and called the technician, a quiet woman named Dana Ruiz, who carried a laptop and spoke with the careful patience of someone used to making complicated things simple. She explained that the toy car was not an ordinary toy. It was a small remote-controlled model Caleb had received for his birthday, modified with a tiny front-facing camera that recorded short video clips to a memory card. Elena had bought it from an online store because Caleb loved filming sidewalks, pigeons, fire hydrants, and passing buses on their walks home. The courtroom listened. Even Brittany listened now. Dana Ruiz said the front casing was damaged, but the memory card remained intact. The last video file had been recorded at 9:47 that Thursday night, near the intersection of Halsted and Monroe. The prosecutor asked permission to play it. Marcus looked at Paul Mercer. Mercer's face had lost color, but he nodded once, knowing refusal would sound like fear. The lights dimmed slightly. A screen lowered at the front of the room with a soft mechanical hum. The video began crooked and low to the ground, from the height of a toy held in a child's hands. Rain blurred the lens. Streetlights stretched into long yellow streaks on wet pavement. Elena's voice could be heard off camera, gentle and tired, telling Caleb to keep close because they were almost home. Then came tires hissing through water, a fast turn, a gasp from someone nearby, and the image jolted toward the curb. The screen shook, then tilted sideways. No one in the courtroom breathed normally. The video did not show graphic harm. It showed something worse in its restraint. Confusion, rain, a fallen umbrella, Caleb crying out for his mother, and then a white luxury car stopped at an angle near the crosswalk. The driver's door opened. Brittany appeared under the streetlight, hair damp at the edges, phone already in her hand. She looked toward Elena, then toward the empty street, then back toward her car. Her voice came through thin but clear. Dad, I need you. She came out of nowhere. A pause. Her face changed as she listened. No, I am fine. It is some nurse. Another pause. Then the sentence that emptied the room of every excuse. She is black, Dad. Who are they going to believe? Elena covered her mouth with her uninjured hand. Caleb pressed against her side, not crying now, just staring at the screen like a memory had become too large for his small body. Brittany's expression went blank. Richard Whitmore did not move. The video continued for a few more seconds. A dark sport utility vehicle pulled near the curb. A man stepped out holding an umbrella. Brittany turned away from Elena and said, "Lower but still clear enough. Just make it disappear." The prosecutor stopped the recording. The screen went dark. For several seconds, the courtroom was nothing but silence and the soft buzz of the projector cooling overhead. Judge Ellison looked at Brittany. Not with triumph. Not with hatred. With the terrible calm of a man watching truth arrive exactly on time. The silence after the video did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting from a road no one wanted to see clearly. Paul Mercer stood with one hand on the table, staring at the dark screen as if the image might come back different if he waited long enough. Brittany sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, all the practiced outrage drained from her face. Richard Whitmore looked older in the space of a minute. The polished confidence had slipped, and beneath it was something bare and frightened, not the fear of guilt but the fear of exposure. Judge Ellison turned to the prosecutor. "Is there additional evidence connected to the recording?" he asked. The prosecutor nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice remained professional, but there was weight under it now. She called Dana Ruiz back to the stand and asked her to explain the audio enhancement performed on the final seconds of the file. Dana opened another clip, shorter this time, cleaned of rain and traffic noise. The speakers crackled softly. Then Brittany's voice returned, lower, tense, speaking into her phone. "Daddy, fix it." A man's voice answered through the phone speaker, faint but unmistakable. "Do not say another word. I will call Patterson. We will clean the report before morning." Richard's hand dropped to his side. Someone in the gallery whispered his name. The prosecutor did not pause. She introduced certified phone records showing a call from Brittany to Richard at 9:48, then another from Richard to a retired police captain named Alan Patterson 6 minutes later. She introduced a revised accident report submitted the next morning, signed by an officer who had not been first on the scene. The first draft said the driver appeared impaired and left before medical assistance arrived. The final version said visibility was poor, the pedestrian entered unexpectedly, and the driver remained cooperative. Marcus read the documents without changing expression, but the room felt the movement of every page. Paper had its own sound when lies began falling out of it. Paul Mercer tried to object, but his voice came out thin. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore is not the defendant in this matter." Marcus looked at him. "No, counsel. But he may be a subject of a much larger one." Richard stepped forward. "Judge Ellison, I strongly advise caution." The bailiff turned toward him. Marcus lifted his hand, stopping the movement before it became a spectacle. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "this is the second time today you have mistaken influence for authority." Richard's face hardened. "You have no idea what you are touching." The words landed badly. Even Brittany looked at him then, as if hearing the threat inside the warning. Marcus leaned back slightly, the state seal above him catching the light. "I know exactly what I am touching," he said. "A woman left in the rain. A child forced to carry evidence because adults tried to bury truth. A defendant who believed race could make a victim less believable. And now, possibly, a coordinated attempt to alter an official record." No one spoke. Elena closed her eyes, not in relief but in exhaustion. Caleb slipped his hand into hers. The prosecutor stood straighter. "Your Honor, based on the evidence now before the court, the state requests that the defendant's bond be revoked pending sentencing, and that all materials related to Mr. Whitmore and Captain Patterson be referred to the District Attorney's Public Corruption Unit." Brittany finally found her voice, but it sounded small, almost childlike. "Daddy." Richard did not answer. He was looking at Marcus, measuring options that no longer existed. For the first time all morning, Brittany turned fully toward the bench without arrogance. Her eyes moved from Marcus to Elena, then to Caleb, then back again. She seemed to understand too late that the room had changed ownership. It no longer belonged to money, reputation, or fear. It belonged to the record. Marcus folded his hands in front of him. His voice remained quiet. Motion granted. The gavel came down once. Richard Whitmore flinched harder than his daughter did. Outside the courtroom doors, cameras waited. Inside, the Whitmore name, once heavy enough to tilt a city, suddenly sounded like any other name being called to answer. The courtroom did not erupt when Judge Ellison granted the motion. There was no applause, no shouting, no sudden release big enough to match what had just been uncovered. Justice, when it finally arrived, sounded almost ordinary. Paper sliding across a table, a clerk confirming the order, the bailiff stepping forward with quiet professionalism, Brittany Whitmore, whispering her father's name one last time and receiving no answer strong enough to save her. Marcus allowed the process to move without spectacle. He reviewed the final filings, listened to the prosecutor, gave Paul Mercer every proper chance to respond, and made the record clean enough that no private phone call could stain it later. By the time he reached sentencing, the sunlight had shifted across the courtroom floor, turning the old tile from gray to gold. Elena Brooks sat upright with Caleb beside her, her injured wrist resting in her lap, her other hand wrapped around her son's. She did not look victorious. She looked tired in the way only honest people look after surviving a lie told loudly against them. Brittany stood at the defense table, no longer smirking, no longer performing. Her cream coat hung over the back of her chair like a costume she had stepped out of too late. Richard Whitmore sat behind her now, surrounded by the silence of men who had once answered his calls quickly and now avoided his eyes. Marcus looked at Brittany for a long time before speaking. This court has considered the evidence, the harm caused, the conduct after the incident, the attempt to distort the record, and the repeated contempt shown toward this court and toward the people most affected. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The law cannot repair every wound. It cannot return peace to a child overnight. It cannot erase words spoken from prejudice. But it can refuse to reward cruelty with escape. Brittany swallowed, her face pale under the hard courtroom light. Marcus turned one page, then placed it flat. For the charges before this court, and within the limits allowed by law, this court imposes the maximum sentence. The words landed without drama, and that made them heavier. Brittany froze. Not because she had not understood English. Because for the first time in her life, English had not bent around her last name. Paul Mercer closed his eyes. Richard stared at the floor. Elena drew in one trembling breath and held it, as if letting herself believe too quickly might hurt. Caleb looked at the judge, then at his mother, then down at the toy car resting beside him. Its camera was broken now, its wheel cracked, its paint scraped thin, but it had carried the truth farther than money had carried a lie. Marcus gave the necessary instructions for the referral of Richard Whitmore's calls, the altered report, and every connected document to the district attorney's public corruption unit. Then he struck the gavel once. The sound was final but not cruel. It closed the case the way a door closes against a storm. When the courtroom began to empty, Elena remained seated for a moment, unable to move. Caleb leaned into her side. "Mom," he whispered, "did we win?" Elena looked toward the bench, but Marcus had already stepped down and was gathering his papers. She wiped one tear with the back of her hand and shook her head gently. "No, baby," she said. "The truth did." Marcus heard the words, though he did not turn around. In the corridor behind the bench, he paused near the same narrow window where he had stood during recess. Below, courthouse steps shone in the late afternoon light. Reporters gathered. Police cars waited at the curb. People hurried past with coffee cups, folders, and lives that would never know what had happened in that room. Marcus looked at his reflection in the glass. For a second, behind his own face, he saw his mother's steady eyes, the blue dress from the photograph, the dignity she had carried when no one wanted to believe her. He exhaled slowly. Then he walked back into the empty courtroom. Elena and Caleb were near the aisle now. Caleb held up the broken toy car with both hands. "Thank you," he said. Marcus crouched just enough to meet the boy's eyes. "You were brave," he said. Caleb shook his head. "I was scared." Marcus gave him a soft smile. "Most brave people are." Elena pressed her lips together, too full of feeling to speak. Marcus nodded once, not as a judge above her, but as a man honoring another human being who had refused to disappear. Outside, the American flag moved faintly in the air from the vents. Sunlight touched the bench, the witness stand. The rows of wooden seats now empty and still. No one clapped. No one needed to. The room held its silence like a prayer. And in that silence, justice finally sounded human.